Hi, everyone. I am Greg Rosenbaum, the head of South by Southwest EDU. I am so excited to have you join us for another installment of South by Southwest EDU Online. Today's session, The Inequality Machine, featuring Paul Tough and Liz Willen, will be addressing the inequities in higher education and the potential for further impact in light of coronavirus. As a conversation originally scheduled for the event in March, before the full weight of the pandemic was felt across the country and around the world, this conversation is now more timely than ever. Paul Tough, the author of a number of best-selling books, including most recently The Years That Matter Most, How College Makes or Breaks Us, will be joined by Liz Willen, editor-in-chief of the Hechinger Report. Now I'd like to turn it over to Liz Willen to kick off the session.
Hi, everyone. It is not as great to be here as it would be to be in Austin, where South by Southwest is an event I look forward to all year, and just filled with so many interesting conversations, and they also have great margaritas. But anyway, we're still here to talk about things that matter deeply. I loved Paul's book, and I loved it even before the crisis that we're in now between the coronavirus and the racial unrest that's happening all over the country, permeated and changed the whole conversation around college. I'm going to start by introducing, first of all, I wanted to show you the book because I loved it so much and you should all get it. You can get it in many different ways. We're not going to be hanging out copies this time or having it available to sign. But I wanted to start by asking Paul, even before you wrote this, even before all of the situation that we're in now, Paul, you spent a lot of years looking deeply at the inequities in higher education. And the question of who graduates from college, really, you do such a good job of telling us this in this book, is determined greatly by your income. So there was an awful lot of inequality. It's been exacerbated, and I'd love to hear now more about going forward, what your thoughts and fears are about how coronavirus and the recent racial unrest is going to change an already really damaging landscape that you described.
Great. Well, thank you for that question, Liz. Thanks so much for doing this conversation with me. And thanks to Greg and everybody at South by Southwest for inviting us. It's great to be here. So yeah, this book, when this book came out in September, I wrote it because I felt like these issues of inequities in higher education were centrally important, not only to higher education, but to the whole country. What struck me when I was reporting this book was that what happens in the years after high school, those key post-secondary years, whether you go to college or not, they have become incredibly important in shaping the upward mobility of young people all across the country. And what's happened, I think, as those years have become more and more important, they've also become more and more unequal. So we can see that in terms of where students go, what kind of students are admitted to what kinds of colleges. We can also see it in terms of what kind of funding we as a society give to these different sorts of institutions. We give tons of money to the institutions that admit and enroll lots of well-off students, and much less funding to those that admit and enroll lots of low-income students. And you can see it, Liz, as you mentioned, in terms of the success rates of students in different institutions. Admissions is part of the problem, but a lot of institutions, I think, until recently, didn't feel like it was their job to help their students, and especially their first generation and low-income students, persist and succeed and graduate. And so part of what I wrote about in the book was the way that institutions were trying to change that. Some institutions, anyway, were trying to change that and making strides to helping more students succeed and graduate. My concern now, and Liz, I think you share a lot of these concerns, is that what's happened, especially with the pandemic, has created a series of circumstances that is just going to make it so much harder for those students to succeed, to get to the colleges they deserve to go to, and to succeed at those colleges. And it's also going to make it a lot harder for those institutions to provide the kind of support, first of all, to have the sort of admission strategy, and then to provide the kind of support that they want to provide.
I think you're absolutely right, Paul. And I think what we should kind of divide this and talk a little bit both about the students and about the institutions. At the Hechinger Report, where it's a nonprofit news service. We're based at here in New York City, but we travel the country. We've been spending a lot of time talking to students before this and even after this about their concerns around being able to afford higher education, especially the kind of higher education that you refer to in your book, which is a lot of at the 4-year privilege level, even though that it doesn't represent how most Americans get their education. That's where a lot of the inequities are felt, and a lot of the discussion in your book and really highlights, plus the discomfort that some of the students who go to those kinds of institutions who not normally would be able to afford it, but go on scholarships and through financial aid and other means, what it's like for them when they actually get there. So we talk a lot about that in the book. We talk a lot about that in our stories, but we're also seeing now enormous uncertainty on top of all of the other questions they've had about can I afford it? Is it worth it? Do I have enough financial aid? Can I get in? All of those questions. Is it possible to even go now? Uncertainty about whether the campuses will open and uncertainty over students' financial situations and their family situations. I know you're speaking to a lot of students who are concerned that they're putting off their plans, they're not going to be able to go at all. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you're hearing and what's going to hold them back and exacerbate these issues.
Yeah, so I think the obstacles, the new obstacles, there were always lots of obstacles, but the new obstacles I think that low income and first generation students are facing right now, they fall into 3 categories and they're all financial. So the first one has to do with the students themselves. So you're right, I am talking to students these days. I'm working on an article about New York City public school students who are graduating this year and are trying to make their plans for the fall. And it's really striking in New York especially, but I think in cities across the country and regions across the country, it's the low income students, first generation students who have been hit the hardest by the pandemic and the economic crisis that
no question.
They're the ones whose families are most likely to have gotten sick. They are the ones whose parents are most likely to have been laid off or fired. A lot of them already in this distance learning senior year are working now full time, trying to support their families. And so what their families might have been able to sort of scrape together and get them and afford for tuition for next year is often really impossible. They feel a lot more pressure to stay home to support their families. So I think that's a huge issue. I think it's starting to become clear in some of the admissions numbers, but I think a lot of it isn't really going to appear until August and September. I think there are students now who are being accepted and enrolling, especially in public colleges, who are just not going to be able to show up in the fall, and we're not going to know the extent of that damage until then. The second level is, I think, on the institutional level. So a lot of, especially private institutions, one of the numbers that really stuck with me in my reporting for this book is that about a quarter of 4-year not-for-profit liberal arts institutions, the sort of private colleges that we all know, they are losing money every year. They're operating in the red, and there are lots more. There were a lot more that were right on that line. And they are just, in their financial situations have across the board gotten worse. And what struck me in my reporting was that how much the admissions offices at those schools had to take into account their own finances and students' finances when they were making admissions decisions. They were admitting students who could pay. And that was this huge pressure that they didn't like talking about very much, but that was really defining and shaping the freshman class each year. Those pressures have undoubtedly gotten worse. I don't think we can see those numbers yet in terms of how it's affecting admissions. But I think for this year, certainly for next year, there's going to be a lot more pressure on them to admit fewer and fewer students who need financial aid, and the students who do need financial aid, they're going to be able to offer less and less. And then third, I'll just say quickly, is on the governmental level. I mean, especially state governments, all their budgets are going to take a huge hit. They already are. And those are the governments, the institutions that support public institutions across the country. In our last financial crisis 12 years ago, the public higher education budgets were cut across the board, and it's hard not to imagine that that's not going to happen again, and it's those low-income students who really suffer.
That's right, and that is also happening at the same time when students are demanding more. I spent a lot of time listening to a webinar on Friday at the University of Michigan, and the college president was very open to hearing concerns from minority students and from Black students in particular who were upset about underrepresentation on campus, about not having enough Black faculty, about not having enough counselors of color not having enough of a lot of things, and really pushing hard for some changes. And the university president was saying, agreeing on a lot of these levels, and he kept saying, I know we need to do a better job, but he was also in great fear of the kind of budget cuts that were coming their way. So, and in every state right now. So this is really problematic. Can you imagine state legislatures saying, yeah, we actually need to do a better job of funding higher education right now?
I mean, I can imagine it. I don't think it's going to happen in many places, but I can imagine. I mean, they should, right? That's the paradox of this, and I think a lot of state legislators know it. It's exactly what our states should be investing in right now. But you're absolutely right. The way that
I think it's particularly a problem at a lot of the flagship colleges and universities, because they tend to be the places that. First of all, I think they're going to be spending a lot of more time attracting out-of-state students who pay a lot of higher tuition. So it's going to be problematic for people in the state. But also, our reporting has shown over and over again, it's where minority students are most likely to be underrepresented. And these are also the schools with the best track record of graduation, job placement, connections, and opportunities. So I think that is going to be, you're right, we're going to see a lot more of that. And I'd be really interested if anybody has questions around that or thoughts about that too. I also, back to your concern about the students, I also heard this week in a webinar that there's some real numbers and data. This is the Strata webinar was showing that there's huge amounts of plans shifting and changing. They used to just call it summer melt, but now it's really significant and documented. 42% of Black students and they're more likely than white Americans to have changed or canceled their plans for education this fall. Half of Latinos have changed their education plans, and 1 in 3 have delayed enrollment or canceled them. So the whole enrollment issue in the fall is already really, really uncertain.
I think you're right, and I think there's going to be sort of shock waves going out from right now that are going to last for years too. So I think we're seeing some of those numbers already. Students changing their plans. I think we're going to see a new wave in the fall when students have to actually show up and pay that first tuition check. I think there's going to be a lot of students who are changing their plans at the last minute instead of knowing they're going to change their plans now. And then I think, that's going to then affect the institutions, right? There are going to be a lot of institutions that where the decisions of their students are going to create more financial stress at the same time that state governments are creating financial stress. And I think that's going to be something we're not going to really understand how bad it is until September or October and beyond.
And you write a lot about, in your book, about the students who, once they get to campuses and they're there on a full scholarship and they may not feel a good sense of belonging. You spend a lot of time with a Princeton student who feels that way and elsewhere. I've been looking for a long time to see what kind of solutions there are. Is it more scholarships? Is it more outreach? Something they talked about at the University of Michigan as well the other day. But what can we do to make it possible for more of these students to attend when there's less and less financial aid, more first generation, more minority students, the kind that Anthony Jack's book, The Privileged Poor, spends a great deal of time talking about how important it is to get more of these students on campus and feeling comfortable there. And yet that opportunity is going to seem slimmer and more fraught than ever.
So I'd say there's the solution has to come at those schools in 3 different levels, and the first one, and maybe the most important one, is on the level of admissions. I mean, what is striking to me is, so a student like Kiki Gilbert, a young African American woman who, when I was reporting on her, was a freshman, had come from a really low income background and was thriving academically at Princeton, but was finding it really hard to feel any kind of sense of belonging. And so I think the main reason for that was just there are not many students like her at Princeton. She had a hard time finding any, and I write a little bit in that chapter about how the way that Princeton counts its low income and its African American students, I think, added to her sense of disconnection. So I think, if those schools, which are the ones that can weather this storm the best, would change their admissions policies and admit more students, first generation, low income students, African American, Latina students. I think that would make a big difference to the students who are there and who are being admitted. The second one is that and I think Anthony Jack has done the best job of pointing out some of these potential solutions. There are actual fixes out there. So he talks a lot about spring break and dining halls closing for spring break, and kind of ignoring the fact that there are a lot of low-income students who have to stay on campus for spring break, and for whom the dining hall is a big deal. I think one of the things he points out is that all of those little policies are problematic for those students on a sort of real practical basis, but they're also they're hard on a psychological basis as well. They're just a reminder that those institutions send, often without intending it, that you don't quite belong here. But then the third thing I'll say is that I do think that some of the difficulties that a student like Kiki face are going to be inevitable. Like I do think that this is a problem that we can do a lot to solve, but I also think that social mobility, the process that someone like Kiki is going through, going from one kind of background to a different kind of future, it's always hard. It's why it's at the center of so many novels and movies and stories and personal stories and memoirs, because it is this sort of really dramatic and painful turning into a new person, coming into a new life. And so I think we have to kind of accept that, like, what Kiki is going through right now is going to be rough. Her institution and the rest of us can do a lot to make it better, but it's never going to be a completely smooth sail.
Two admissions decisions that you brought to that you discuss in the book, and that I think are coming up more than ever right now. And of course, the whole scandal with Varsity Blues and the photoshopping of athletes and celebrities doing anything to get their kids in have put more pressure on this issue as well. I went to a conference about this in January. It was all kinds of earnest discussion about things that could change. I'm not holding my breath on, but at least there are a lot of people working on it and thinking about it. One, of course, is ending legacy admissions, which you've talked about as well. And the second really is changing the testing requirements. And you're seeing that a lot right now with more test optional and the SAT and ACT being eliminated as a criteria in many places. I'm wondering if you think any of these things will make a difference and can make a difference. You spend a lot of time talking about the role of the College Board in all of this.
Yeah, I think all of these changes can help. I mean, I think when you're in admissions at one of these institutions, there are all of these pressures that you feel to admit more high-income students and admit fewer low-income students. Legacies is part of it. Athletics is part of it. U.S. News and World Report and keeping your average SAT score high is part of it. And so changing any of these policies helps. It helps take some of that pressure off and gives those institutions, makes them feel like they have more of an opportunity to admit more of the sorts of low-income first-generation students who could really thrive on those campuses. So I do think that this push towards going test optional that has happened as a sort of an accidental result of the pandemic is a step in the right direction for a lot of these institutions. I think the fact that the University of California is going not only test optional for the next couple of years, but then test blind the couple of years after that, it gives them a tool to admit the kind of lower SAT, higher GPA students who tend to be, are more often statistically to be women, to be Black and Latino or Latina, to be first generation, but also to be, right at the top of their class, exactly the kind of students who are great at school, who work really hard, who have all of the skills that they need to succeed in one of those UC schools. So I think it's a great step. But what I found when I was reporting at Trinity College, this private institution in Hartford, Connecticut, is that it's not enough, right? So they had gone test optional, but their admissions department still had all of these pressures, despite their genuine desire to admit more low-income first-generation students. They had all these pressures, just basically bottom line pressures to admit more full pay. And so I do think the push toward test optional is an important and a good one. I just want to make sure we're not persuading ourselves that it's going to change everything, that this alone is enough to really change admissions, because it also just takes a different way of thinking about your finances as an institution, and it takes some real institutional will as well.
And boy, are they going to have different ways of thinking about their finances soon. And not that they had wanted. I want to open it up to questions soon, but before we wrap it up, I feel really strongly again about talking about some of the solutions. And one of the sections of the book the yearbook that I particularly liked took place at the University of Texas, Austin, in the classroom of Yuri Treisman, who is a very well-known mathematics professor. And he seemed to spend a great deal of time with some of the first generation low-income students there in their calculus course, not just helping them get through calculus, but showing that how if they could make it through that, it was one of those make or break moments. And you focus particularly on a student and her travails around that. And I believe she's overcome a lot since then. That particular classroom was a vivid example to me, and the kind of caring you saw in that, and attention to how you could create some kind of change. Tell us a little bit more about what you saw in that classroom and how it might be replicated elsewhere.
Sure, thanks. So, well, the first thing that I want to say about University of Texas is that I think it's important in understanding what's going on in the classroom there to understand how their admissions policy is really different than almost every other flagship in the country. So as you just pointed out, and I've reported as well, it's the flagships in Alabama and Michigan, in Missouri, and lots of other places where the numbers have really changed, especially over the past 10 years or so, toward more full pay, more out-of-state students, fewer low-income students, fewer students of color. And that is really goes against our image, certainly my image, of what those flagship public institutions are supposed to do. It's been less true at the University of Texas, in part because of this novel admissions program that they have had for the last 20 years. The Texas state legislature created this thing called the Top 10% program, where if you're in the top 10%, now it's the top 6% of your high school graduating class at any high school in Texas, you're automatically admitted to UT Austin. So what that means, because of the way the state works, is that you do get lots of students who are the kind of students who would be at the University of Michigan or the University of Mississippi, white, well-off, high scoring, but you also get students who are the top of their class in low-income students in low-income schools, rural schools, schools in the Rio Grande Valley, schools in the inner city. And so those students show up on the UT campus, and they're great students, but they have lower test scores and less preparation and less family support in many cases, and certainly more financial problems. And they are often the students who struggle the most. And so UT, to their credit, have over the past 10 years or so done a lot to try to level that playing field and to try to think about those students as an issue that the college really has to take on. And so that exists on all sorts of levels in terms of financial aid, in terms of student services and support. But what I saw in Uri Treisman's freshman calculus class is that it can also take place, and really needs to take place, in the classroom. And Uri is a fascinating guy, a fascinating teacher. He's in his early 70s. He's been doing this for a long time. And he is really attuned to the fact that there are some students for whom freshman calculus is this barrier, it's the first thing you hit as soon as you get to Austin from your small town. And for a lot of students, it is the thing that convinces them maybe not to stay at UT, but certainly not to stay.
Drop out of college, yeah.
Or not to stay in the same. He wants to do the opposite. And so his class gets a lot of those first generation low income students. And the one who I spent the most time with was a girl named Yvonne Martinez from public high school on the west side of San Antonio. And she was top of the class, second in her class, the salutatorian, but she had relatively low ACT scores, didn't have a great math program at her school, but she wanted to be a math major. And she got to UT and really struggled at the beginning in this freshman calculus class. And what was interesting for me in watching it is that, so Uri has read a lot of the psychological literature about how classrooms and professors can do a lot to increase a sense of belonging and improve the mindset of students, convincing them that they can succeed. The problem for Yvonne was that she was hearing from Uri that she was going to succeed, she was going to be a genius, she was going to be a math major, but then she kept taking tests and in midterms and exams and not doing particularly well. And so what was so fascinating to me about her experience in that class was that it was obviously mathematically taking place on a very high level. But it was also this question about, like, can I really fit in here? Can I really succeed? And she was hearing these very different messages. And what worked for her was partly Uri's support and encouragement, but it was also the work of other tutors and study groups that she was a part of that encouraged her to push herself and to take more chances and to be okay with failing and making mistakes and to learn in groups, all of these specific tactics that Uri and his team have learned over the years. And she ended up pulling it out of the fire at the last minute, graduating with an A, acing the final exam. And she's now just finished her junior year. She's a math major doing high level math. And what strikes me about her is not only that it shows how much work it takes on the part, not just of students, but of the institution in order to help students succeed when they come in with that kind of background. But it also says something to me about admissions, because Yvonne is exactly the kind of student who doesn't get admitted to the flagship state institution at other schools. She wouldn't be getting in if she was in Indiana or Mississippi or anywhere else because of that SAT or ACT score.
Yeah.
But when she gets in, when students like that are admitted, they do great, and with a little extra help. And they are exactly the students who are going to change Texas and change the country. So when institutions can I think, put that kind of support in place, and that goes from the president's office all the way down to the TAs, it can really make a difference.
Very interesting. Well, I love that story. I'm going to take some questions now and see what kinds of things folks want to know that can we can try to address. So here's a couple of them for you, Paul. Oh, wow. This is really hard. This is a really tough one. With all the inequities in higher ed, where do we start? What is the most important thing to focus on first? You want to try that one, Paul?
Sure, I want to hear it too. But, I mean, I would say it depends who the we is, but we as a country, the place to start, I think, is money. We really just are not funding our public higher education system the way it needs to be funded. We have changed in this in terms of how the economy works, what we need from young people, right? The economy has shifted in this way that they need credentials and experience and education beyond high school. And in contrast to other periods in American history, we have not decided that we as the public are going to pay for that. And all that is behind, I think, so many of the problems, certainly the inequities in higher education, the cost of higher education, the problem of student debt. It's just because we decided that higher education was not going to be something that was going to be a public responsibility. It was going to be something that was going to be a private responsibility. And I think that's just been disastrous. It's been disastrous for middle-class families, for some upper middle-class families, and definitely for low-income students and families. So this is obviously a rough point to talk about increasing public funding for higher education. Most states are going to be trying to go the other way, but it's exactly the moment that we should be talking about that. And I think the sign of hope is that in the Democratic primary anyway, that this really was a conversation that was going on. It's not always going in exactly the direction that I would want to push it. But I do think that there's a chance that we could have a very different kind of conversation about how the role that the public plays in financing public higher education. What about you, Liz? What do you think?
Well, I think that you're pointing out something that's been kind of a thread through our entire conversation. And I think we just have to keep remembering that we're in this really tough economic situation, which we've been in before. But even in better times, the emphasis on state legislatures, education is always one of the first things that's cut. So I think it's possible that education, that the colleges are going to have to do a better job making, and higher education in general is going to have to do a better job making a case for itself. And convincing people. And I think right now what we're really seeing is that the high joblessness rate is going to be on a lot of folks' mind. And so people considering going to college and thinking about it as an opportunity to get a great job or even a job at all is going to be, I think you'll have much more alignment in that kind of thinking among the public, and I think that will go down to the state legislatures. But I think this is something we're going to be thinking and hearing a lot more about. The question of where do we start is so large. We did a piece this week. I'd love for anyone to take a look at it on our site, and it's really more about what college presidents are saying right now. And although it has to do with the race issues, we're talking a lot about some of the business decisions that colleges have made over the years, and some of those decisions have made it more difficult for all kinds of people to afford college. Another big question that people are having as they're thinking about it. So Another related question about that is someone asks whether lower prices, really lower prices, would make a difference. Maybe colleges don't need PhDs to teach most classes, they're asking, or even tenured professors. So generally, I don't see press releases about colleges lowering prices. Definitely don't hear much about that, but that is a question that's come through. What do you think, Paul? Lowering prices, would it make a difference? And we have something on the Hechinger Report called Tuition Tracker that I would love anyone to see. You can plug in any college in the country and see what kind of, what you'll pay with what the full pay price is. Some of the numbers of like when you get over 80,000, it gets to be a little bit daunting. So lower prices, is that a possibility?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a great idea. I do think that that price is a real issue. I just think that it's not just about colleges cutting back. I mean, I think there are places where colleges can cut corners, but I'm not sure whether having highly qualified professors and instructors is the way to go. I mean, I think there is already this big disparity between the kind of instructors that high income students at the most selective institutions are getting compared to students at community colleges or less selective public institutions. And so I don't necessarily think that the solution is to make more schools have less well qualified instructors. But I also think we need to remember that tuition is just part of the number of how much education costs. I mean, one of the things that still really sticks with me from my reporting on the book is that those most selective institutions, Ivy League and similar institutions, we focus on how incredibly high their tuition prices are, and they are, but they are spending on each student each year multiples of that amount. They're spending $200,000, $300,000 a year educating their students, and that's true at lots of institutions. Every institution is spending more than they are, at least not-for-profit institutions are spending more than they're taking in. It's just a question of how much more, right? And so again, this for me goes back to the question of public support. I think the reason that prices are so high is not necessarily having to do with things that the institutions are doing. It has to do, it's certainly on the public level, of how much we as the public are willing to devote to public higher education. That's why the University of Texas, the University of Michigan, that's why they're so much more expensive than they used to be, and so much less accessible to everybody else.
Got it. I like this question as well. This one is interesting. The exacerbation of social inequities is visible even in many countries that do have free access to college tuition. This question asks whether the effects are worse in the US in comparison. What do you think about that, Paul?
I think I don't know. My guess is yes. I think that the more that higher education becomes a consumer good rather than a public good, and I think that's true in the United States more than in most developed countries, the more those inequities appear. But I think, but I don't know enough about the international comparisons to be able to say definitively if that's the case. I do think that that's a great point, that it's not just about the money, that the kind of inequities that are happening in higher education relate to inequities that are happening at home, happening in K-12 education. There really are differences between how well prepared students are when they get to college, and so that's an issue. And getting rid of the financial pressures on students, if we could do that on the higher ed level, would not on its own level the playing field. One of the things that has struck me from the reporting I did for this book, but also from more than a decade of reporting on education and equity in general, is that it is we've got to solve this problem in lots of different ways at once. And so for higher education to say, we got to wait until K-12 gets its act together before we can fix our problem, that's not going to work, but it won't work the other way as well. There's lots that higher education can do even without K-12 inequities being fixed.
Okay, interesting. So somebody would also who is asking about the Trinity College example. And just as a reminder, the Trinity College chapter in Paul's book looks largely at the practices of wanting to admit more students who could get into college, who could do the work, but can't afford the price tag at a private four-year school like Trinity. So that questioner would like to know if what you found there is actually the strongest possible argument for free college.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a good argument to be made for free college, and I think what I saw at Trinity is part of it. You know, I would say two things. One is I would distinguish between private institutions like Trinity and public institutions. You know, I do feel like there is a distinction between them, and there should be, that public and it's public institutions where I feel like all of us should feel more of a sense of responsibility, where things have to change and where we have more levers to change them. You know, Trinity, I hope that Trinity is able to admit a more diverse class, but it's kind of their business mostly. I think they would do better. And, you know, Angel Perez, who at the time was the head of admissions at Trinity, felt the same way, that it would help the institution to have a more diverse class. So I'll say that, but I'll also say, you know, I think free college is you know, it's a great idea for tuition to be lower, and certainly for some college to be free. I think making community college free, for instance, is a great idea that we should do more or less right away. But I don't think, I think it can be a little bit of a red herring, that it can distract us from what is the more important question, which is how much is the public giving to these institutions, investing in these institutions to educate our kids. And, you know, the answer for the last few decades, and certainly the last decade, has been that we're investing less and less. And so that has partly led to the increase in tuition. It's also just led to those institutions having fewer resources. And so having, you know, employing less qualified instructors, paying them less, having more adjuncts, more temporary professors, worse facilities, all of the problems that you see when you go to a less selective institution these days. And so I want to make sure that in going towards free college, we're not just cutting the budgets of those institutions, but instead we're replacing those tuition costs and more with public funding.
Right, and this is a debate that's gone into some of the presidential debate questions as well. Yeah. So it's interesting to see what the different positions the candidates have on it. I love this next question only because it reminds me of something that you and I are both hearing a lot of it. We're certainly hearing a lot in our reporting, and it's really the reality of what education looks like right now. It's online. All of these students were sent home from campus, and they're scrambling to finish up their years if they haven't already. Graduations took place last month, and somewhere this month. So they really had to, without a lot of thinking, suddenly colleges had to switch all of their learning online. Initial reports were not a very satisfactory approval rating for this way. Part of it is because there wasn't a great deal of thought and preparation going into it, and I think you're going to see an enormous effort on that now, especially since a lot of schools are going to be offering sort of a hybrid model of partly being online, and maybe you can go back to campus. A lot of it is totally unsettled. But the question on that is, how will that impact the university importance to underprivileged families? I just know from what I was hearing from a lot of students that I spoke with who had to come home, suddenly some of them did not have laptops. They didn't have the equipment, or they were not in homes that even had the proper wiring and internet, so they couldn't even do their work. So the question is, how will that impact the university importance to these underprivileged families? I mean, they can't get an education unless they can access this. So I think you're going to have to see a lot of changes right now in how, not only in what online looks like, but who can access it. And I'm sure you've heard some of this from the students you've spoken to as well, Paul.
Yeah, I have, and it's you're making a great point. And I mean, you know, I do think that this is an opportunity in some ways. I do think that there we should be able to find some ways, better than we have this semester, to use online learning as an aid to students. It does make sense, and I do think that there are people out there who are working on solutions, and I hope we can push in that direction. The reason that remote learning and online learning, both in higher ed and in K-12, makes me nervous is that the evidence is that when we move to it, it is, first of all, it is unequal, as you've said. It's harder for low-income students to make it work from a technological point of view, just in terms of having space in the home, from having the kind of support and mentorship that they need while they're working. But I think there is also a push. You can already see this in the way that this online revolution has happened over the last while, to push these sorts of online courses towards low-income students more than anyone, and to have this be a cheap, easy, alleged solution to the struggles that low-income students are having, and they really are not working. And so I get nervous that we're going to see an overly hasty push towards online learning, especially at less selective, less well-funded institutions, and that's really going to hurt the students who are there. The one chapter in my book that I think about when I think about online learning is the chapter where I wrote about this, another Austin institution called Peloton U, a small nonprofit that is working to try to solve this problem of how we can do a better job of providing online learning for low-income students. And the solution that they've got is that they're working with Southern New Hampshire State University, which has done great work doing online degrees for lots of different students around the country. But they're pairing that with a model that involves an actual storefront in Austin where students have to come and sit 10 hours a week, where there are mentors, there are snacks, there is a sort of sense of camaraderie, and there are advisors and tutors who are working side by side with those students. And that's what we all need. You know, it's really hard to be a person to be motivated enough to completely make your way through an online degree with no help. But a little bit of help can go a long way, and that's what Peloton U has figured out how to do, and do really cheaply.
That's great. And I mean, really, that is so much related to the conversation we were having earlier here. How will this impact the university importance to these underprivileged families? Well, a lot of the students that I've been speaking to say that if it's going to be online, like I heard one student say to me, if I am going to be sitting in front of my screen, I am not going to college. And it just doesn't make sense. If that's what they have to look forward to, online learning for the next year or even the next semester, I think you're going to have a real drop off in enrollment and also in enthusiasm. And you can try to make it a really powerful, engaging, and interesting experience. And I think what we've heard from college students is that there's a long way to go. But if that's the future of it, it also takes away the very many opportunities that we're talking about that people go to college for in the first place, especially to have all of the mentoring and the help and the full college experience. I mean, quite frankly, there were plenty of students who told me that they don't want to go if it's online because they don't want to miss the football games and the fraternity parties and the dorm life and the fun that they were going to have. And even though that, again, is a small percentage of US college students, you can't ignore that is something that goes very much with the entire college experience at a place like UT, at the flagships, and many other places.
Yeah, no, I think that college experience is a big deal for every
huge
student.
deal. And also this, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, it kind of, the next question kind of riffs on that a little bit, and I think it might be the enthusiasm for getting rid of tests, and it really turns into the whole online experience. Somebody wonders whether, should we be questioning testing in college courses the same way we're questioning tests like the SAT and the ACT? So we really talked about that in terms of college admission. But now what about testing, as you know, all of your work is online and then testing online too. I'm wondering how we throw out, how you examine the student performance when it's all online. If you throw out the testing, I don't know if you can go to essays and just class discussion and participation. It looks a lot different online. But I'm just curious if you see any sort of equity reasons to throw out testing in college courses, just like while we're getting rid of the others.
I don't. I mean, I do think that the SAT and the ACT are the way that they, you can see it in the data that they tend to help students who already have lots of privilege, and they tend to hurt students who don't. And so that's why I'm opposed to them more than anything else. And the reality is that if you look at high school grades, which are very much reflective of tests and assignments and participation and everything else, those are the slope of how well high income versus low income students do on those is much lower. And so I think they are a fairer playing field. I don't think it's right to say no one has to, take a test in the future. I do think it's, I think there are better and worse ways to evaluate how much a student learns in a class. But I don't think that the fact that the SAT and the ACT have their problems means that we shouldn't have tests at the end of semesters. What about you?
Well, I wonder if it could be gamed. I mean, I don't think any of us can forget about the people who paid for somebody to take their students' SAT and ACTs as part of the admission scandal in Varsity Blues, that you could have somebody else come in and actually take it for you.
Right.
So
they can just show up in your apps.
yeah, and I'm still struck by the section in your book where you talked where there was a young woman who got a pretty decent ACT score, would be good enough for many colleges. It was a 25 or 27. And with the help of some tutoring, she got it up to multiple acts of tutoring. She got it up to a 35. I think about that example a lot and what I've seen in not only in your book, but in general about covering this topic is just how much money can influence test scores and who does well and who gets in. And so I'm far more interested in this question in terms as a sorting tool and in terms of fairness and equity than talking about it in college courses, because I think once you're already there, it's a completely different scenario and question than it is in terms of how much we've shown these tests can be gamed.
Yeah, and I think, I think people who are opposed to test optional admissions will make the case that, yes, the SAT and the ACT might have a bias towards rich kids, but so does everything else, right? So do letters of recommendation, so do extracurriculars, so do sports, so do high school grades. And there is certainly an element of truth in that, though the data is clear that the SAT and the ACT are do more to favor well-off students than high school grades. But I think it's also true that, even if a student is getting lots of tutoring on their actual high school classes and is taking advantage of that, they're still learning something, right? It is harder to gain. Like you still have to do the work, I think, in order to get good grades. And so while I do wish that there was a way to level the playing field even more completely, I do feel like there's a difference between that sort of tutoring and exactly what I saw in that tutoring office in DC, where students in just a few months were able to boost their ACT and SAT scores by so many points.
Yeah, it it was so clear to me. So we're going to be wrapping up soon. The final question really kind of looks at something you didn't touch upon much in your book, but is super important going forward and raises a lot of questions for the future of education. The question is whether online education is more affordable now at community colleges. I think the real question is what role we're going to see community colleges start to play. They've really been known for the longest time as an engine of economic opportunity in this country. And another question was asking about how we engage the middle-aged worker who has to re-educate to align with not only future AI advances, but future economic changes. And we definitely saw a big increase in community college enrollment after the last recession, particularly in areas like Michigan, where there was a real retraction in the auto industry. So community colleges play a real role in retraining, and also they're going to be offering a lot of online courses now. I just want to say that we have written stories lately that have been very, very well read, which talk about if students started a community college, what people want more than anything, whether it is online or in class, is the opportunity to transfer, because you can save a lot of money by starting at, say, a community college in Texas and then transferring to a flagship. But the problem has been all these agreements over and over again, whether it happens easily. There's questions about what credits transfer and whether you can make a seamless transition. But I think that four-year colleges are going to have to be really pushed to answer and make these transitions smoother right now, because for the next few years, a lot of students, and the ones that you and I are talking to, may very well say, yeah, I'm going to take this course online at community college. It's a lot cheaper. And then I'm going to keep doing that. And maybe I'll enroll for the next year or two and then transfer.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the frustrating thing about when you look at community colleges and that whole sector in higher education right now, it absolutely should be the solution to first of all, to the problems of so many low-income students, but also to the larger economic problem that we're in right now. Students don't want to travel as much. They can't afford the same kind of high tuitions as in the past. it makes a lot of sense. It should make a lot of sense for a lot of students who are graduating right now to spend a couple of years at a community college where they get their basics done and then spend the last 2 years at a more expensive 4-year institution, right? That's how the system was set up. That's how it should work. But the problem is we are not investing enough in those community colleges. And so they aren't working the way that students need them to work. They're not able to get the kind of instruction they need, to get the kind of support they need to find their way into the sort of classes that they need. And so that is the sector where I really hope that this pandemic and the financing problems that are going to come along with it pushes state governments and city governments to change their thinking about higher education, partly in terms of funding those institutions better, but then second, exactly what you're saying, to improve transfer so that it just becomes a normalized way for a lot of students to make their way into higher education or make their way into the workforce. You know,
and more students and more different kinds of students. I mean, I spent a day at recently at a Borough of Manhattan Community College where they had a whole, obviously before the pandemic, they had a whole daycare situation set up there so that the students could finish their work, or could go to school, get their degrees. These were older students, non-traditional students, while they didn't have to worry about their children. I mean, I think that's what we really need to do is be, and you know, the title of your book and our session, The Inequality Machine, if you want to make it a more equitable situation for all, then what you really need to be able to do is open up opportunities at less expensive institutions and have them be better resourced. Community colleges are constantly suffering from budget cuts, and there's been layoffs all over CUNY, and those are students that you're writing to now. So there's going to be a lot of work to do to make this a more equal situation and open up education to become the great equalizer it was supposed to be, but often isn't. But I've really enjoyed this conversation. I don't think we have any more questions, but I want to thank Paul and the folks at South by Southwest for having us today and for being so nimble and turning around at such an important conversation during this impossible and difficult time.
Yes, well, I'm sorry we're not able to hang out in Texas and enjoy some tacos after our talk, but thank you.
Next year.
Thanks, Liz, for doing this.
Next year. And thanks again to all the folks at South by Southwest.
Me too. See you in Austin next year.